as 6 different organizations coming together to talk about collective, collaborative carbon action. All of us have a different place in representing this conversation, from mindful materials to building transparency to the Urban Land Institute, Skanska Development, Tishman Speyer, and Hudson Pacific Properties. And our speakers today are myself. I'm Annie Bevan. I'm the Executive Director of Mindful Materials. I'm going to let my esteemed panelists also introduce themselves when it's their time, but we're joined by Stacy Smedley for Building Transparency, Marta Shantz from the Urban Land Institute, Bob Pratt from Tishman Speyer, Anna Duffy from Hudson Pacific Properties, and Sarah King from Skanska Development. Really appreciative. Everybody's name is actually easy to say, which is exciting when you're introducing folks for the first time. But thank you all very much for joining us from these organizations, and for those listening in. I think everybody has a really wonderful message to share with you all in terms of, from an owner's perspective, what is it that it means to commit to action when it comes to materials, when it comes to carbon, and how is that integrated throughout the ecosystem. Been doing a lot of work personally for some years now, trying to bring a defining moment of what collective action can look like. And it's sort of culminated to the fact that we do need owners who are everyone's customer to come together to define what does good look like, and all commit surrounding the same common language of prioritizing and specifying and requiring products that have started to reduce its impact throughout the built environment. As we get more and more owners on board, more change can be made, because ultimately everybody down the value chain will start to see a return on investment for their investment in sustainability. So we have some wonderful owners here today, and no pressure, guys, but I'm really excited to hear your perspective, and everyone, I think, is excited to see examples of what you all are working on and how you're really taking this responsibility seriously to drive change throughout the value chain of the built environment. So like I said, to kick things off though, I'm Annie Bevan from Mindful Materials, and we got together with Stacy and Marta, and we were like, how do we do something together? How do we share some of this impact work a few weeks ago? And ultimately we came to a discussion of how can we share a little bit of each other's roles in this space, and how that ultimately interconnects together. And that is a role that Mindful Materials is seeking to play and is playing in the marketplace. We've seen a lot of these pledges, these commitments in the past. You know, we need EPDs, we need HPDs, or else we're not going to specify your products. This happened back in 2012 when the first round of architect and design letters got sent out to all major building product manufacturers. And what happened? The building product manufacturers reacted to their customer in fear of not being specified. But there's been you know, an endless amount of transparency invested. Some would argue not enough. Some start to optimization, where building product manufacturers are starting to consider, how do we reduce those impacts and how do we talk about these things in a different way. But to date, we haven't really been able to identify when and why better material choices are used, or even what better looks like. And we have this plethora of transparency data, but no real way to really identify what product's doing better than another. And like I know Stacey's going to talk about this, but after these initial pledges came out, there was a stack of EPDs and no real way to compare or understand how to look at these things. So this group in particular, and our organizations collectively, sort of have identified the market needs, which is a common framework, connected data, and collective action. And so we, as Mindful Materials and all the organizations here today, are to talk about how we're providing tools, experiences, and examples of how we're addressing these things to bring change to the marketplace together. And at Mindful Materials, we were originally developed by HKS. They were getting asked by a ton of owners, hey, we want to contribute to the materials and resources credits within LEED. Can you help us? And HKS was going to all these different manufacturer database websites, finding information in different areas, finding wrong information in some areas, and no real centralized place to find sustainability, transparency information of building products. And Ultimately, Mindful Materials as a library and a tool was born out of HKS in this need to collectively bring this information into one place. Because we believe materials need a voice, an advocate, an aggregator, and a collaborator. And that is ultimately what we're trying to enable for the marketplace today. There's also sort of been this lack of awareness of a common framework. What does good look like when it comes to materials? There's been certainly a mess of information everywhere, not digitalized and not being discussed and committed to in the same way. So Mindful Materials is working on a way to bring and define a common language, eliminate the mess, and digitize this information in a collaborative way with other tools that are out there to try and enable change. So right now, as we exist in the industry today, sustainable materials are few and far between on every project. And we are here to change that, but we need everyone's help to do that. And if we were to define what Mindful Materials is now and into the future, we are an industry-led collective and collaborative movement, making sustainable materials clear to identify, easy to find, and the standard for every building. So we're working on a common framework that starts with commitments at every level of the value chain, owning those commitments, bringing more people on board to start with a commitment to change, and then working with our collaborative friends within the industry who are providing tools, digitized tools in various areas to support what action and good looks like. I don't think anyone can really start anything without a motivation to do something. And so what Mindful Materials is becoming as a collaborative hub is that starting place to commit to specifying products in a different way, making decisions about products in a different way, requiring sustainable products in a different way, and being a home to the owner's pledge, the contractor's pledge, the AIA materials pledge, the manufacturer's pledge, and other various commitments the built environment can make together, like the antimicrobial statement. Because what we're trying to do is demonstrate the power of common language to drive collective action. And ultimately, today we are hosting and want to bring aboard all of these wonderful folks to share the work that they are working on to try and shrink the industry to make all of this work to decipher what does good look like a little easier. And so I actually failed in the introduction, as I promised. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A. And we will be having a question and answer series after everybody speaks to their place in this movement throughout the presentation at the end. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Bob Pratt from Tishman Speyer, who's going to talk to Tishman Speyer's role in really establishing what is a common framework that all owners can commit to in terms of action when it comes to materials, and what does good look like when it comes to their work. So with that, Bob, I'd love to hand it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Yep, thanks. Can we go to the next slide? So many of you may know Tishman Speyer. We're a global developer. We currently are active in the United States, Europe, India, China, and Brazil, as well as a number of places in Europe. We are, if you can go to the next slide, we're a global developer. We're also a fund manager, and we're an operator. We've been building under sustainability standards since I've joined the company in 1998. We think about what we do very carefully in terms of relationships. The relationships that we have around the globe, I think this webinar is a perfect example, coming together to discuss important issues and put them into action. We think our great ideas really spring from our relationships. Go to the next slide. So what we do is it allows us a platform to be bringing these ideas forward in a global way. Next slide. Our sustainability actions are really focused in the whole of the ESG universe. The sustainability side of what we do are focused on our sustainable development goals. And go to the next slide, please. I think the things that we're focusing on today are really delivering operational efficiencies and managing our impacts. Next slide. One of our big commitments internally is that we've signed on to be operationally net zero in carbon by 2050. And here's some current examples of things that we're involved with. We're doing work right now in Alston for Harvard on the Harvard Enterprise Research Campus. The original phase one is going to be you can see 900,000 square feet in phase A and another 1 million square feet. Everything that we're doing from the basic programming has us committed to working to sustainable goals and to working our reducing our carbon footprint on the project. Next. In San Francisco, we're working on a project in collaboration with the San Francisco Giants, helping to build a new neighborhood outside the ballpark. This is another project of over 2 million square feet. It includes residential, office, and lab space. It's got a high affordable housing commitment. And go to the next slide, please. Again, we're working to high LEED certification, and we're working very hard on our embodied carbon effort, primarily through concrete, where we're using a concrete mix with a low carbon certified reduction versus normal cement. Next slide. In Madrid, we're working on a project called Puerto De Santo. This really kicked off internally a commitment for us, again, to continue working not only to our higher environmental standards, but also introducing life cycle analysis into our standard development playbook. So the life cycle analysis process is something that we've recently adopted and are implementing now in all of our development projects across the globe. So the next piece, I want to talk a little bit about the owner initiative. If we go back to conversations at the time I was in China with the ULI Greenprint APAC meeting that we participated in, it became clear much of the dialogue focused on the ability of the industry to gather materials that could be reliable when it came to looking at embodied carbon and other pieces of the analysis of materials. Next slide. That led to some dialogue. Some of you may know Rafer Wallace, founder of Reset, who has been a constant kind of instigator along with many of the people on this call in terms of talking about this subject. Rafer and I worked very closely with Urban Land Institute to come up with the unified request for US ESG data of building materials, starting with carbon. And I think that collaboration with Mindful Materials, with Annie, and with ULI, and with really a rapidly growing network of collaborators across Asia initially, and it's now spreading around the world, has allowed to put the common ask in place. Our targets are really to get science-based, trustworthy, and accurate information that can be brought into the project execution process. Next slide. The owner initiative, the idea is very simple. It's basically a commitment on the owner's side to begin to ask for data in regards to ESG impact of materials. There wasn't this common language that is leading us to collaboration to allow this to go forward. So the crafting of this was I think, pretty simple, a simple idea, but it needed to get put into action. And this was rolled out with ULI at the end of January of this year. Next slide. So this is not only meant to focus on the pure materiality, but it also, in fact, impacts and looks at all ESG impact areas for the project. So why should you participate? You know, the signatories are going to have really a support system and a tool, a collaborative tool to allow action to take place. We've collected a lot of our friends, both on the development side, owners side, architects, engineers, professional organizations, and it's got some momentum behind it. So how does this all work? We're basically going to be, as a group, taking in complex ESG data and to begin to score it in a unified way. And then to be able to aggregate the results at project level and then really across the industry to begin to create benchmarks so that people can actually see how people are performing, how progress is being made, and to provide enhanced and accurate ESG reporting. So we think this is going to become, again, a new benchmark to allow projects across the world to have a common language in terms of talking about these issues. So the owner initiative, our primary signatories are owners. We've got a lot of support from the architects and engineering community, suppliers, and special groups. And I would urge all of you on the call to reach out to Mindful Materials, to Annie, to see what you can do to get involved and to participate in this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate you sharing your insight of what Tishman Speyer is doing. And thank you also for your creativeness in creating that pledge so that there is a place for owners to join a commitment area. And like you said, I would encourage any owner or architect, contractor who wants to support owners in achieving these goals to sign on to that commitment, to put your brand associated with this action that we're trying to facilitate in this call. So Bob, thank you so much for that insight and your genius there. And I'd love to hand it off to Marta then from ULI to talk about their role in this action.
All right. Well, thanks, Annie. Thanks, Bob. Hi, everyone. Pleased to be here. My name is Marta Shantz, and I am the Senior Vice President for the ULI Greenprint Center for Building Performance. And ULI, or the Urban Land Institute, is a real estate industry group with over 45,000 individual members across the globe, with the mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. So we want to do a lot here at ULI, and within Greenprint specifically, Greenprint is part of ULI's research arm, and we focus on climate mitigation, so making the business case for green buildings by tying reductions in carbon emissions to increases in asset value. And we cover topics ranging from city and real estate climate policy to sustainable tenant fit outs to embodied carbon, which is why we're all here today, to everything in between. And as you may have noticed on the prior slide, our team published a report called Embodied Carbon in Building Materials for Real Estate not too long ago, specifically to prepare the real estate market for a low carbon materials future, to make the business case for why real estate should be paying attention at all, to highlight smart steps to reduce embodied carbon, which is a lot of what our owner speakers will be talking about today, and then also showcase peers who are addressing the issue. In addition to our research work, specifically, ULI Greenprint uniquely includes a community of practice of real estate leaders committed to improving the environmental performance of the global real estate industry. And what we're able to do as Greenprint staff is share these best practices and promote that business case to the broader ULI membership and the broader real estate industry. Collectively, these Greenprint real estate members have a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. And also we've set a goal to achieve net zero carbon operations by 2050. And many of these Greenprint members, including all three of today's real estate owner speakers, are exploring how to take action to reduce embodied carbon as a part of their broader portfolio-wide ESG strategy. None of this happens in a silo anymore. It really is part of a holistic process. And across ULI, what we're doing is we're hosting events and webinars about the topic of reducing embodied carbon. We're holding panels at our major ULI conferences, spring and fall meeting, and Europe and in Asia Pacific as well. And we continue to see interest from membership all over ULI on how and why they can reduce embodied carbon in their work. Now, conveniently, there is a business case for it. So it's not just about the environmental benefits. And the way we see it is sixfold. And I'll briefly speak through these different aspects just to give a little background on what the motivation is for reducing embodied carbon in real estate developments. First and foremost, regulations are very much coming, and some of them are already here. Across the globe, we're seeing updates like Buy Clean California. We're seeing low carbon concrete codes, both in the US and internationally. We're seeing, for example, the city of Vancouver setting a embodied carbon reduction target. We're seeing the city of LA set ambitious embodied carbon reduction goals. And the Netherlands have an entire circularity goal to be 100% circular by 2030. So these goals are very much driving proactive real estate developers to think about how to prepare their projects for these futures. Additionally, a lot of green building certifications and reporting initiatives consider material selection and embodied carbon reduction in their scoring structure. So being able to reward material selection that is low carbon, things like LEED and BREEAM, EDGE, and a number of others across the globe incentivize reductions in embodied carbon through material selection. And that is certainly a driver as well. And not only low carbon materials, but also the reuse of existing buildings. The just procurement of EPDs at all is an important step as well. And those life cycle analysis, as Bob was mentioning, there are other ways that green building certifications are pushing the industry to move on this. Additionally, while there isn't necessarily data yet to prove that low embodied carbon buildings are worth more or cost less, there is data to prove that there is not a cost premium for sourcing lower carbon materials. And I think Stacy will speak to that a little bit, as well as some of our other folks here on the call. But it's not necessarily an incremental cost when you go for those low carbon materials, especially when you have smart design choices. And so when you're designing with embodied carbon reductions in mind, you don't have to pay more. We have a project from one of our members developed a prototype for a building in San Francisco with a project with CLT, cross-laminated timber, as opposed to the conventional structural materials. And it was only a few dollars per square foot more, I think like 70 versus 72 or something like that. Just really, really small increments. And there are also indirect benefits for the construction side of things, like faster construction time with modular design around mass timber, and other benefits of low carbon materials. Granted, a lot of times these days, even just to win a development bid, you have to have a really strong ESG platform for your bid and your development when you're looking to take over a site, and generating that community goodwill through commitments around embodied carbon reductions is one way that real estate developers are differentiating themselves amongst peers and competitors as well. So not only are there competitive benefits on the financial and innovation side, but also just on the opportunities to win a bid and build a building. And then lastly, we're also seeing demand not just from the community and cities, but also from residents and tenants. Developers are reporting increased interest from tenants in things like mass timber and just low carbon materials in general for the health benefits as well. Both aesthetically and architecturally, there are benefits. And not only are there reasons for that, but also because a number of these major tenants that real estate developers are itching to acquire to serve as anchor renters in their buildings are setting large sustainability goals themselves. And so they need to be able to align their buildings and their developments with those high quality tenants' sustainability goals as well, which are often more and more including embodied carbon. So a lot of reasons to think about the business case and why owners are clearly starting to take action on this. But from here, I will pass it to Sarah King to talk about how Skanska's ESG strategy overall is coming along, with specific details on embodied carbon commitments and the actions that they are taking.
Great. Thank you, Marta. It's lovely to be here. Good to see everybody. My name is Sarah King. I lead sustainability for Skanska Commercial Development here in the US. We're the owner developer arm of Skanska, and we can switch to the next slide. For anybody not familiar with Skanska, we are a global real estate development and construction company headquartered in Stockholm, Sweden. We have a presence in the Nordics, Central Europe, and across the United States. Here in the US, we've got 3 business units. We've got a civil construction group. We've got our Skanska USA building general contractor group. And we've got Skanska Commercial Development, which is what I'm representing. So those dots on the map that you see are the markets that I cover and where we're active as a developer here in the US. So Seattle, Los Angeles, Houston, DC, and Boston. And we do mainly new construction, office, and multifamily products. We do LEED certification at 100% of our projects and aim for a minimum of LEED Gold, with many of our projects achieving platinum. And embodied carbon, we are using the EC3 tool on 100% of our development projects now going forward. Next slide. Skanska's also got an ambitious global carbon target. And Marta, I think if you click twice, we'll see the other 2 things appear. So by 2045, we aim to be carbon neutral. And that's not just in our own operations, but also our value chain. So all the products we sell and all the construction materials and embodied carbon upstream in our value chain. And we do have a 50% reduction target by 2030. Next slide. So then as we break down those value chain emissions, where the majority of our carbon emissions lie, there's that operational carbon piece of buildings that we've all been focused on for a long time and will continue to be super important as we move towards net zero. We can't take our eyes off the operational carbon, the energy efficiency of buildings, the HVAC systems we're putting in place, the high performance envelopes. Those are going to be absolutely critical going forward. And we also have to deal with embodied carbon. And so this is a newer topic for many of us. And so this is something that we'll dig into a little bit more today, but just all that energy and the carbon associated with the manufacture, transport, installation of all those construction materials that we use to build our buildings. Next slide. So an interesting thing for me is that with operational carbon and embodied carbon, on the operational side, during the lifetime of that building, you continue to have these knobs to turn where you can optimize, improve your energy efficiency. You've got opportunities during the lifetime of the building. On the embodied carbon side, you really just have like limited bites at the apple here, and then things are pretty much locked in. You've kind of spent your embodied carbon when you use those construction materials to build a building. So for me, there's these 4 windows of opportunity where we can really have an impact on embodied carbon. And knowing that people on the call are kind of coming at this from a variety of perspectives, I thought I'd hit on all 4 of these. There might well be more, and my fellow panelists can chime in if they think of other ones. But number 1, renovate. So if you own an existing building, or if you're buying land with existing structure on it, can you reuse that structure? Is that something that you can incorporate into what you're going to build and your vision for the future of that land parcel? The second one, if you're doing a new construction build, when you're early in design, what are you going to build that building out of? And Marta touched on this, but is it going to be a traditional steel and concrete building? Will it incorporate mass timber, CLT? Will it be some kind of hybrid? How can you really challenge your architects and other design partners to use carbon intensity and optimize the embodied carbon when you're deciding the materiality of your building? The third opportunity here is around in the new construction phase, when you've already decided what you're going to build your building out of, but you're going out to the market and you're selecting suppliers, you're purchasing those construction materials. And this is where the EC3 tool is really designed to help all of us as owners, developers, contractors, architects make smart decisions when we're selecting suppliers. And then the fourth window of opportunity that I see is on that interior side. So maybe it's a new building and you're doing the interior fit out for the first time. Maybe you're renovating some space. Maybe you're just getting new office furniture and putting new carpet and paint in. There's an opportunity there, even if it's on a smaller scale than the core and shell, to impact embodied carbon. So there's really a lot of opportunities for all of us, no matter where you sit. From myself, and kind of where my comments are focused today, are on these middle 2 areas. Skanska does do mainly new construction and core and shell. So those are really the areas where we have the most opportunity for impact. And then next slide. So a project example that I thought I would share, again, we're using this on all of our development projects now, starting as of last year. This is a project in Bellevue, Washington, just outside of Seattle. The 8, it's an office tower, 25 stories. We just broke ground on it last month. And we use the EC3 tool to optimize our embodied carbon on this project. And so up at the top, you'll see kind of the output of the EC3 tool after we upload all of our material quantities from our construction estimate. And it gives us an idea of really where we should focus. We really lasered right in on wanting to optimize concrete, structural steel, and rebar for this project. And so we worked with our structural engineer to get language into the specs. We sent that out to the suppliers. We are lucky to be in Seattle, where mixed specific concrete EPDs are already kind of business as usual. And so we were already kind of like 10 steps ahead where some of other markets are. In terms of just being really able to use the EC3 tool as it's best designed to really use that supplier selection and compare suppliers. And so from all that, we were able to achieve a 21% reduction versus that 2021 carbon leadership baseline through just concrete and rebar supplier selection. And like Marta alluded to, this was at no cost premium to us. Again, if we want to kind of push forward and go much deeper, I think that there will start to be some of those cost premiums as we work with suppliers to really optimize and kind of push the limits on this. But this just shows that if by being kind of smart customers, what we were able to achieve just by taking carbon intensity into consideration alongside price and schedule and the other normal things that are part of the procurement process. And next slide. So this is my last slide, just a few kind of lessons learned so far that I think could apply to anybody out there who's thinking about embodied carbon. First one, this is kind of like a no duh, but collaboration is key. This is kind of a new concept. I think that for me, from an owner perspective and from a core and shell developer, structural engineer, contractor, and owner are kind of like the 3 most important people. I think sometimes it's tempting to kind of put the responsibility on one of these parties and say, like, you take embodied carbon, but this totally needs to be like a collaborative team effort. And then second, incremental progress is still progress. It's okay to start small. This can be overwhelming if you're thinking about applying this to your whole portfolio or even all the construction materials that go into a building. It's okay to just pick one building and start with concrete or rebar and just figure out with your own process and your own company culture what's going to work for you. And so, for instance, like I mentioned in Seattle, the EPDs are already there. The concrete suppliers are already doing this. And that's true also in LA. So we're ready to just jump right in and sort of use that EC3 tool really well to select suppliers. In our other markets, in Boston and DC and Houston, we're doing a lot of supplier outreach, explaining why we care about EPDs, what we're trying to do with them, how it's going to help us make our procurement decisions. And so in those markets, maybe just getting the first supplier to create a mixed specific concrete EPD could be a real win. And Stacey's got some good stats on this, but there's just not that many across the US, like concrete, those mixed specific, a lot of them are relying on the industry average. So in order to really be making those informed decisions at the local level, we really do need to move that needle. Third takeaway, inertia is real and timing really matters. This is a new thing to add to a process that's already complicated and there's tons going on. This is a really busy time in a project construction period is when you're making these supplier selections. And so I think it's just like, this is as much a people and culture thing as it is kind of like a technical problem to solve. So just, you've got to really think with your own organizational hat on what's going to work and how are you going to embed this into your process. And then don't do all this work and then miss that opportunity. I think it's sometimes things just get moving so fast that we just revert back to kind of the old way that we picked suppliers and we forget that, oh, we did all this extra work and we put this language in the specs. We have to remember, like, at that key moment, how can we make sure the right people are at the table and you're really bringing that carbon intensity factor in. So you're looking at that alongside and selecting your suppliers with that in mind. And then the last point is, I think, why, in some parts, why we're all here today, but it's demand shifts markets. And so what we're trying to do as Skanska on the owner side is impact upstream, our upstream suppliers. We're trying to send the signal that we really do care about embodied carbon. It's a factor for us in our procurement decisions. We buy a bunch of concrete, steel, and rebar. And it's great. And Marta mentioned this too. We need more from the downstream side too. So there are some tenants who are starting to ask about this, and it would be great. And I think as we want to push this further and really accelerate progress on the embodied carbon front, we need more of those tenants. You know, as we sell our buildings to investors, it's exciting if somebody asks a question about embodied carbon, and hopefully that becomes more of the norm going forward. So I think that we're all customers, and we can all use our voices to really shift the market in this way. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah and Marta. Awesome stuff. I love seeing the business case, and then Sarah, just amazing work that you're doing and really demonstrating what action and good could look like. So thank you very much for sharing that. With that, I'd love to hand it over to Stacy from Building Transparency to share a little bit more about the EC3 tool that was just mentioned a bunch of times as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for setting me up to introduce building transparency and our main focus. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to dig into just really giving everyone an idea of what building transparency, who we are and what we're up to. So Anna, if you can go to the next slide. I'm currently the executive director of Building Transparency. It's a nonprofit that was established here in the US in January of 2020. And its key focus at that time was to take over the continued management and scaling of the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, or the EC3 tool. And I'll get into a little bit more about that in a minute. But the mission of Building Transparency is really to provide the open access data and tools necessary to enable action across the industry in very keenly addressing embodied carbon's role in climate change. You'll see our board is largely large tech owners that have engaged in this with zero carbon commitments and are really trying to impact their supply chain and provide tools that they can use, but also that the industry can use. So if you go to the next slide, our current funders and partners, this is also very important to Building Transparency, and I think speaks to what others have said around how this is collaborative, and it's going to take all of us across the value chain when it comes to construction and buildings. We have pilot partners and funders kind of across that value chain. Pilot partners engage with us to help us make tools, largely EC3, better, so it's constantly improving and meeting their needs. But we also have funders like jurisdictions like King County, manufacturer partners that want to ensure the data quality of the EPDs in the tool. So I'm just really proud of our current funding partnership, and I think it speaks to how we all need to play a part in this work. If you go to the next slide. Again, we are keenly focused on supply chain emissions and construction. So I know we always typically use the slide around the buildings and greenhouse gas emissions of buildings. I've actually moved to use this slide now in my presentations because it's keenly focused on the emissions of the materials and how much of that pie globally is in manufacturing, and how much of that manufacturing pie is really building materials like cement, iron, and steel, that other categories where other things would be falling. So we are a big part of the problem when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions, just in this manufacturing of materials and how we think about circularity, and we need to be doing what we can to reduce that. So to the next slide. Again, we started as just the manager of the EC3 tool, and we launched Embodied Carbon. I think the analogy I've been using lately is it's like an onion that we peel back layers to, and as you peel back the layers, more things are needed when it comes to transparency and free and open access data and resources. So we started with the EC3 tool. We now currently also have been gifted the Tally Lifecycle Assessment tool from Karen Timberlake, and are working on a free open access version of that tool to be released for whole building LCA in the next 1 to 2 years. We have a digital standard for EPDs that's been piloted this year, starting with UL, in terms of a way to standardize EPDs into a digital format that allows EC3, but also other tools like Mindful Materials to take in that data in a standard way and make it more actionable for industry. And then we're also working on how we get to better data and more transparent data that feeds into those EPDs. Marta mentioned policies. We are seeing an uptick in policy. The Colorado policy for Buy Clean just passed and was signed. The one in Washington for funding a pilot of the Buy Clean policy is also part of the budget that's approved. And there's federal policies now being proposed on both the House and the Senate side that include Embodied Carbon and Buy Clean. So we have to be able to provide the data and tools that policy needs to also be implemented and actionable. Then the next slide is just getting into, I think what Anna's gonna pick up, just continued program and resources, working with manufacturer partners, working with other organizations like UL and Mindful Materials is really important. We've come up with a few carbon action networks. It started with a materials can group that's manufacturers coming together to educate their peers and tell their stories around embodied carbon accounting and reduction of their products. Owners Can is newly launched in 2021 and is a group of owners that's come together to align on the asks around how they quantify and reduce embodied carbon, what they put into language for their architecture, engineer, contractor partners, and what they're asking manufacturers to produce. So resources are coming out of that. And then on our buildingtransparency.org website, we have a resources section where you can download template language, EPD request letters, and other things that would help you start your embodied carbon journey. The next slide. If you need a proper demo of the EC3 tool that was mentioned, I didn't want to do that today, but please reach out to me and my team at Building Transparency. We're happy to get on a call and walk you through the tool or link you to some of those groups if you're a manufacturer or owner or AEC professional that is looking for some peers that are doing this work. With that, I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thanks, Stacy. I can get to the next slide. Sorry. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Duffy. I'm with Hudson Pacific Properties and sustainability analyst. And we'll be talking a little bit about our efforts in embodied carbon. First, I'll give some background on Hudson Pacific and our Better Blueprint platform. So Hudson Pacific Properties is a West Coast based REIT. We own office and studios up and down the West Coast. So Vancouver, Seattle, LA, and the San Francisco Bay Area are our primary operating markets. And we have an ESG platform called Better Blueprint. Our 3 pillars on focusing on sustainability, health, and equity. We have a ton of ESG focused goals that I won't go all into today, but I'll focus very specifically on our carbon goals. So talking about where we are today and where we're focusing our efforts in the years to come. So in 2020, we were very proud to achieve net zero carbon across all our operations, 5 years ahead of our 2025 goal. We did this through a combination of energy efficiency, on-site renewables, off-site renewables and RECs, and carbon offsets. And we were really thrilled to be one of the first major real estate companies to achieve this milestone, but we know that there's more work to be done. So with regards to operational carbon, we've set a science-based target to reduce our absolute emissions, and we've really doubled down on our focus on embodied carbon in our development and major repositioning portfolio. So in 2020, we published a sustainable design vision that outlines our ESG expectations and aspirations for our development and repositioning portfolio. The first version of it included multiple criteria. So deploying adaptive reuse whenever possible. This kind of speaks to what Sarah was referencing, using existing structures rather than demolishing buildings entirely and building from the ground up. Achieving LEED Gold certification or higher is a requirement for all of our development and major repositioning projects. And we had included a requirement to measure each project's embodied carbon footprint. So after first publishing this, we started out on our journey to measure each project's embodied carbon footprint, gained a really solid understanding of what it takes to do that, working across all the stakeholders, working really closely with our development team, and just establishing the baseline for what it entails to understand a project's embodied carbon. And so this year we refreshed our sustainable design vision to further this goal and actually require project-specific embodied carbon reduction targets. So with this, we'll be establishing baselines and ambitious targets for each project that we engage in. And we're working closely with our development team and again, other key stakeholders to ensure that we can effectively meet this requirement and start achieving reductions like Sarah mentioned of 15, 20, 30% reduction in embodied carbon across our projects. And so we were really thrilled to be invited to join Owners Can and be one of the founding members. After we achieved net zero carbon, we recognized that embodied carbon is kind of the next frontier for our industry. And as one of the leaders in achieving net zero carbon, focusing on embodied carbon, we knew that we could play an integral role in driving the industry forward and teaching what we've learned, and bringing everyone kind of along with us, like us and Sarah and Tishman. We're really thrilled to be a part of this group. And so we joined Owners Can, and just as Stacy mentioned, Owners Can is a sister program or counterpart to Materials Can, and it's a group of building owners and developers dedicated to measuring and reducing embodied carbon of projects. And it was a group created to raise awareness on embodied carbon in the built environment, share strategies and lessons to inspire others to follow. These are some of our goals here, but the one I want to highlight most is that last one there. So using our collective influence as owners to advocate for industry action on embodied carbon. And here is a little image of some of the organizations that we're working with. So Sarah from Skanska, Kilroy, Facebook, we wanted to really get representation from different owners. So like developers, specifically tech companies who are developing a lot of real estate, owners who then lease the space like we do. And we've felt that we've really achieved that, getting a good variety of owners across the spectrum. And so one of the things that we've been working on with our group is, well, I should say our first and probably most impactful deliverable is this embodied carbon action plan. So as we've all kind of identified throughout this webinar, we really need collective action, and a lot of owners are still in the very beginning stages of figuring out what it means to address embodied carbon. And so in order to build market awareness and adoption of embodied carbon studies and reduction, the market needs to know how to do it. So we set out with a goal of creating this toolkit that could guide owners in their journey of addressing embodied carbon in their developments. And we had a few ideas of what we wanted it to entail. So we knew that the toolkit should cover all phases of a development project from beginning to end, so users can identify strategies to reduce embodied carbon, whether they were in the design phase or pre-con or the construction phase. You'll see those kind of outlined on the left-hand side here in the project phase and sub-phase. We knew that it must address different EPD adoption that exists between regions. So similar to what Sarah was saying, some markets like Seattle are super far along and you can get mixed specific EPDs and there's other markets like on the East Coast that EPDs are just becoming a thing. So we knew that we had to guide owners in helping push the market through that as well. And then we knew that this toolkit should be useful for all stakeholders engaged in a project. So beyond just owners, which speaks to our name, architects, structural engineers, GCs are all really key players in addressing and reducing embodied carbon. And so we set out with including them in the audience for this toolkit. And then lastly, we knew it couldn't be too overwhelming. We wanted to provide the right amount of information so that people aren't so overwhelmed that they just don't know what to do and feel paralyzed. So this is kind of an overview of what that embodied carbon action plan is shaping up to be. It's still in its draft form. Stacy is really the mastermind behind it and has done an incredible job building it out. And it's been a huge honor to be a part of developing this. Credit to Sarah as well for offering so much input and expertise in putting this together. And so some other features that I mentioned of the action plan, so it'll be kind of filterable by who's using it. So we want to be able to bring all of the necessary stakeholders along with us and offer that how-to guide for everyone needed to address embodied carbon. So all different stakeholders will be able to use it and kind of understand the role that they play. And then this really is kind of like the full picture view of what the embodied carbon action plan will will detail out to. So each kind of chapter has a main request, key actions, and key steps that describe everything required to achieve that strategy on reducing embodied carbon. And so as I described, some owners may be in the very beginning stages of their embodied carbon journey and may only be able to reach this point of setting embodied carbon benchmarks and targets, or they may only be just like learning that they need to demonstrate market demand for EPDs. And so owners can really filter through and select what applies to them. And one of the key features of this embodied carbon action plan that we're really excited about is the resources that we'll be able to offer. And Stacy mentioned some of those that are already available on the Building Transparency website, but we're working together as a group of owners to offer these resources that'll be included in the embodied carbon action plan. So things like template language to include in RFPs for general contractors. What are you looking for as an owner on reducing embodied carbon? What are you expecting of your architect in designing for minimal material use? Or what kind of language should you include in your specs to reduce embodied carbon as much as possible? So we'll be including kind of this customizable template language that owners can, in an ideal world, just kind of drag and drop into their contract language and kind of demonstrate this collective action and common methodology for pushing embodied carbon studies and reduction. So we're really excited. It's still in progress right now. And kind of going all the way back to what Annie was saying, we're working really hard to develop this common methodology and demonstrate this collective action through a how-to guide on addressing embodied carbon. Look forward to sharing it with everyone when it's available. And with that, I will pass back to Annie to drive Q&A.
Great. Wow. You guys are busy over there. That is awesome stuff, Anna. Thanks so much for sharing that with our group here today, and just kudos to everybody who's involved to making that a reality. And I think everybody said it the same thing in many different ways, but common language, common framework, and tools to actually take action collectively together is what every single person here in our organizations are representing. And we want to bring more people into the fold and fun here of embodied carbon action and change throughout the supply chain. So with that, I'd love to open it up. If anybody has any additional questions, to put it in the Q&A. There was a really good one that I wanted to bring up to particularly the owner audience. But the question was, sustainable development is expensive. However, I suppose big projects can benefit from economies of scale, and project developers are able to charge through the high costs to the final customer. With that in mind, how is the residential market going to benefit from this movement? Small projects cannot benefit from economies of scale. Can we emphasize movement? I actually don't know the word there, but basically, is there going to be spillover to the residential sector? Does anyone see that happening at this point in time? Maybe multifamily. Anyone care to take that one on to start?
I mean, we're using it today on our multifamily projects, the EC3 tool. They're not small scale. They tend to be larger buildings. But I do think as this becomes more mainstream, just like we're seeing individual households having, options to do energy retrofits through your utility, or, kind of ways to engage homeowners. I think as this becomes more mainstream, I absolutely think we'll start to see it when people are doing a major renovation or something, just that this will become something we become more fluent in. But that's my best guess.
So starting larger scale, and we'll come down to the smaller scale in the near future, once there's more data out there and sort of bigger construction pays for more readily available data, imagine.
Yeah, I would chime in. We agree. We're using it on projects, and particularly here in San Francisco right now. So it's just becoming a common way of working for us, of how we approach projects, and the benefits are going to pass on to the people that end up living in those new projects, the residential project.
Great. Another question that I saw Sarah noted, how do you challenge your architect to make more sustainable building? I'd be interested to know what the panelists suggest, because the vast majority of architects, engineers, and other construction professionals have zero experience in sustainable design, no matter what their website says. Anyone on the panel care to comment about that, of how as owners are you communicating with architects, contractors, et cetera, to really drive this collectively throughout the built environment value chain?
Well, if you don't mind, I want to call out Sarah real quickly on this one, because you had an interesting story about how you reached out to a supplier like a year before developing to give them a heads up. Can you speak to that? Because I thought that was creative.
Yeah, I think we're doing that in a lot of markets. And I think it also answers a little bit this question about like the architects, engineers, contractors, because I think it's about starting the conversation early. And if you've got one stakeholder on that whole design team who's passionate about embodied carbon and can sort of like get the group thinking and pull the relevant people to the table, then you're doing some of that education along the way, just by the nature of like inviting the structural engineer. If they're not already on top of embodied carbon, have them come to those supplier outreach meetings that you're doing, explain the importance of APDs. And, so we're starting to, right when we hire an architect, we're putting that into the RFP with this is a priority focus for us, the embodied carbon reduction and operational carbon. And, we always work with the same general contractor because we've got our Skanska USA building partners in-house, and they build all of our projects. So we've got that kind of built into our contract, is that embodied carbon is part of our way of doing business. But I do think that like the idea that you have to have everybody be an expert, I don't think you have to. I think that this is the person who asked the question said it's a steep learning curve. And I think that's absolutely true. And that this is part of how we're doing it, is in real time.
Nothing like hands-on learning. So yeah.
I'll echo the same. It's a day one conversation. And I think who shows up at the table with us, we spread our net pretty wide, and it's something that we talk about on day one before we even make choices in terms of who's going to be on our consultant team. But it's incredibly reminiscent to the early days of LEED being applied, that there were consultants who had no idea what LEED was, and here was an owner asking them questions about it. And I think it's right. You don't need to be expert when you start the project, but you want to go along and participate and gain that expertise as you move through a project. So it's something that it's a day one, and it's early, right? You've got to hit this right from day one, from a leadership position as an owner, that this is going to be part of the project.
And there are a growing number of architects and structural engineers who are absolute experts and super smart on this.
Right.
So,
yeah,
their website is accurate. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
I would echo that and say, in our case, we've worked really hard to socialize our sustainable design vision with our development team, and making sure that our development team is socializing it with our architects and structural engineers, so that everyone is familiar from the get-go with what we're expecting of our projects, and then our aspirations as well. If we can include on-site renewables, let's think about that early in the process. So making sure everyone's familiar with the requirements, and yeah.
Great. Well, with that, I think we're at time today. I thank you, panelists, for joining this conversation. It is so wonderful and a breath of fresh air to see this amazing action, and then also the collaborative dialogue between all of our tools and programs. And if anyone's interested in starting with any of our organizations, get in touch with any of us, and we can connect the dots and shrink things down for you, so you're not reaching out and having a 1,000 different calls with 1,000 different people. So thank you all for being here today, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your Tuesday, and talk to you all soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Marta.